Welcome To Know the Love of Christ.
Welcome back to Know the Love of Christ. If you were with us on the last episode, you know that we were in Mark 6, verses 30 through 40, through 44, not 34, which is the account of where Jesus feeds the 5,000. We discussed several different things about how he went to a desolate place to rest after a spiritual high and low, that he wants us to be partners with him and expects us to work with him, and that when he took the 5 loaves and 2 fish, he divided them, but by doing that, he actually multiplied and fed the whole crowd. And we also discussed how Jesus doesn't just supply our needs, but he surpasses them. So if you're ready, we're going to be in Mark 6, verses 45 through 56 today, and Dee will be leading us. So if you want to follow along, go ahead and pause here and read that account, and then we'll dive right in.
Great, thank you. Okay, so the deserted place where Jesus fed the 5,000 was on the other side of the sea. And he's sending them back now to Bethsaida. So they went from Nazareth to this deserted place. I looked at a map. I was really geeking out on this. So I took out the Bible map and I, was measuring it. It's approximately 25 miles from Nazareth to that deserted place, plus a boat ride. And I noticed last time people got there on foot to follow him. Okay. Now he's sending the disciples back to Bethsaida. Now, Bethsaida is the hometown of Philip, Andrew, and Peter. Now, Bethsaida is a region where the tetrarch Philip was in charge of. Now, Philip, if you recall, was Herod's brother.
Yes.
I just thought that was kind of cool.
That is cool.
I didn't realize that until studying. All right, so starting in verse 45, 45 through 52, this is where Jesus walks on the sea. And this would be the Sea of Tiberias or the Sea of Galilee, because he's still in that deserted place. So this account here is in Matthew, also in chapter 14, 22 through 33, and in John 6, 15 through 21. So all three of these accounts are after the feeding of the 5,000. Mark, as he's been doing so far, in his book, he goes straight to the point, Whereas Matthew and John, they both give more details to this account. Matthew adds a lot more to the end of this event, and John adds something at the beginning which explains what's said in Mark and Matthew, yeah. In other words, he says in verse 45 in Mark, immediately he made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side while he sent the multitudes away. Now, in John's account, in John 6, verse 15, it tells us, therefore, when Jesus perceived that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he departed again to the mountain by himself alone. Now, whenever he goes to the mountain by himself alone, it's usually to pray. But he sent the 5,000 away. That's 5,000 men, of course, men. There were women and children too, I'm sure. They wanted to make him king. So he took it upon himself to, I guess, dilute the excitement and the whatever it was they were feeling to want to make him king. Verse 49 of Mark 6. Did you have anything to say yet? I'm sorry. I'm just going on and on.
No, I was really interested in verse 48. I went and looked up the different versions to see how they worded that about him, like how he saw them. Like ESV says he saw that they were making headway painfully. And NIV says that he saw the disciples straining at the oars. In fact, that was probably the most popular translation, straining at the oars. New Living Translation said he saw that they were in serious trouble, rowing hard and struggling against the wind and waves. And then the American Standard said, seeing them distressed in rowing. And I was just thinking, like you said, at the end of that verse, it says he intended or he meant to pass them by. And so I did a little digging on that word, like, what does that mean, like intended? And the Greek is thelo, and it's a desire or a wish, and or being intending or designing to do something, so making a decision to do something. But in the Helps Word Studies, because I was geeking out on this part, it said wanting what is best or optimal. With
that
that
changes
desire
things.
part, yeah. And so I was just thinking about, sometimes God sees us struggling in a trial and he leaves us in it. And a lot of times we're very tempted to say, why isn't he rushing in and saving me? Why isn't he taking care of this? And he doesn't pull us out of it because he expects us to pull him into it. He wants us to put him, he's already there, but we have to invite him in.
Mm-hmm.
And then on top of that, we can't grow without struggle. And God knows that. And it made me think about James 1:2-4. Let me grab that real quick. Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. And then it goes on to talk about wisdom. But he allows us to be refined through our trials because his glory shines through those when we persevere. And it's a testimony to his faithfulness. And Jesus, he intended to pass them by, but they saw him, which we're about to get into. And anyway, just a little side rant there for you. That's what it made me think of.
Yeah, I just thought it's just another, when you look at verses 48 and 49 and 50, so it's just another scene of Jesus's compassion as well.
It is.
Because you look at him and he had already been off by himself praying on a mountain. He came down and then he just decided to walk on the water. And like y'all said, it says that he meant to pass them by, but they saw him and they were terrified. And God, Jesus could have just went on and passed them by, and I think it was one of those things, like I think it was Stephanie who was saying, we have trials and stuff, and sometimes God will, let us go through those trials, and we're kind of like, why won't he help me, or this, that, and the third. But it's also like, he's always there. And I just thought that was interesting. Like, this is just another scene of his compassion. Like, I could just pass y'all by, but no, I don't want you to be afraid. I don't want you to worry. I don't want you to stress. And he's like, take heart. It's me, don't be afraid. So I thought that was interesting. I like to see his compassion throughout.
If you think about it for ourselves, we're worn down, we're tired, we're struggling. And we might see Jesus, or he may appear to us. I don't mean in a miraculous visual. Yeah, but doing things in his providence that we should be cheerful. We should cheer up to see him. But their reaction to it is they were troubled or they were terrified. So at this point, of course, we have the Bible to help us understand it better, but they couldn't understand that. They couldn't see what was happening there where we can. So, like, to apply to us, we may have Jesus' providence, his power helping us in our struggles, but will we be terrified? Will we think it's a ghost? It's not real. It's not, and we're wondering who he is, or what's happening, where he's saying, cheer up, it's me, I'm here, So he went up into the boat to them in verse 51, and the wind ceased, and they were greatly amazed in themselves beyond measure and marveled. He had to get right up on them, right there next to him, before they finally realized who he was, what he was doing. And look at verse 52. It says, for they had not understood about the loaves because their hearts were hardened. So that means they didn't have faith. They still didn't have faith. I'm not going to mock them, but because I would be the same way. I know I would be like, it is a ghost. I would believe more in a ghost than in Jesus. It's a sad commentary, and he's telling them is because they have no faith.
I thought it was interesting between Matthew and Mark. Matthew 14:33, he details it as they worshipped him.
Mm-hmm.
And then Mark 6:51, here it says they marveled. Well, it doesn't say they marveled. That's my wording of it. They were utterly astounded. And, it says that right after the wind ceases. He got in the boat and the wind ceased, and they were utterly astounded. And I think that's, we look at those two words, utterly astounded, and then the word worship. And that's really what it is when we worship God. It's that awe, that just mind blown kind of a thing. At least that's the way it should be, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, a lot of times Stephanie sometimes gets in a rut, and Stephanie sometimes gets into going through the motions. And I'm sure there's someone else out there that does that as well. But worship, and we don't even need a miracle or the wind to be ceased to do that. And that's what they have here. Jesus working in our lives should cause utter astonishment and worship, just like it did for them.
Yeah, I thought about another thing that had crossed my mind is like when they were terrified and different things like that. And I'm going back to verse 51. But another thing, when he tells them, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid," and we establish like that's his compassion. Then you notice in verse 51, and he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased. And it made me think of Matthew 11:28-30, which talks about, "Take my yoke upon you, for my burden is light." And it made me think of that because it's, going back to them, and you see like in verse 52, they didn't understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. And it's just another testimony of who Jesus is. It's like, I know that life can be hard sometimes. I know that maybe your faith can be a little shaky sometimes, or you may not fully understand everything, but it's just kind of like, I'm here for you. I got you. And as long as you walk with me, as long as you stick with me, I'll make sure you understand what it is that you need to understand. And so like these apostles, like even though they didn't understand everything, it seems as if like in verse 52 their hearts were hardened, so they might have been struggling with their faith a little, trying to truly understand who Jesus is. They stuck with him the entire time though. I mean, we have the incident of Judas obviously betraying Jesus, and that was to fulfill prophecy. But you even think about Peter, and when he denied Jesus those 3 times, he just swore up and down like, "Lord, I'm not going to do that." But of course, like, you've been walking with this man the entire time, you know what he's capable of. And once again, it's just like you refuse not to believe him. You rather believe yourself and who you are instead. And then when it happens, you cry. So you see Peter's compassion. But it's just amazing to see that through all these things that they went through with Jesus, they never left his side. They always walked with him. And I think that says a lot about us today. We deal with a lot in life. Life isn't always easy. But if we continuously walk with Jesus in the good times and in the bad times, and praise him throughout the good times and the bad times, like, we'll never really truly, I guess, struggle to the point where we can't get back to where we once were, or better off than we once were, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I didn't realize until I was studying this out. I mean, maybe I knew at one point, I just forgot that Matthew is the only account with Peter walking on the water here.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and that's, as a kid, that's the story you hear. It's not, I mean, it is Jesus walks on the water, but there's always Peter walks on the water too. And I didn't realize that's the only gospel. Like, in my mind, I've never mapped that out and been like, okay, this is the only place that Peter, I mean, because Jesus walks on the water and, the other 3. But,
which is surprising because in the very first episode of this season, we talked about how Mark more than likely got his information from Peter because he was close with Peter.
Oh.
So, yeah.
And this is not a good look on Peter in Matthew. And
No, it's not.
And I wonder, Rick and I talk a lot about John. John likes to kind of tattle on Peter quite a bit. If you go through the book of John, and we always say that's kind of like a rivalry. We're playing around. I have no idea if that's true. That's just something my husband and I talk about. And so I'm like, it's surprising to me that it's not John, because John, where nobody else mentions Peter by name, like when Peter cuts off Malchus's ear, John says, it's Peter. And then when they're running to the tomb, oh, I beat Peter out, and then at the, by the sea, Peter, do you love me? Peter, do you love me? Peter, what's it to you if this man should live till I come again? And so we were talking about that. I'm like, I'm surprised that John didn't mention Peter walking on the water and sinking here. I mean, just interesting little thoughts to the side. Which one other thing, I don't know if y'all have ever noticed this. I got really excited about this. Somehow in Job 9:8, that it mentions God being the one who walks on the water. Like ESV says, who alone stretched out the heavens and trampled the waves of the sea. But in KJV and NIV say treads on the waves of the sea, and NLT says marches on the waves of the sea. And I just thought that was cool.
That is really neat.
Because this is, the only time we hear about God walking on the water, but Job mentioned it, so...
There are several, we'll have to do an episode of that, but there are several miracles specific for Jesus. Like when John sends his messengers to Jesus and said, is it you? Are you the one we're waiting for? And he says, what do you see? The blind are healed, the deaf are healed, and, all these things he lists. And these are miracles specific to Jesus. All right, so let's move on. Brittany, did you have anything?
No.
All right, let's move on to Mark 6, verses 53 through 56. So when they had crossed over, they came to the land of Gennesaret, and anchored there. Gennesaret was where Peter did his fishing work. That's where he was called by Jesus. That's in Luke 5, 1 through 11. And, of course, Andrew, James, and John. Now, in verse 54, immediately he gets swarmed. So when he comes out of the boat, immediately the people recognize him, ran through the whole surrounding region, and began carrying about on beds those who were sick to wherever they heard he was. This is just nonstop. He got rid of the people in the deserted place. He went and prayed. Now he's going through it again. John 6:21 says they were immediately at shore when he got into the boat. So there's no rest, probably no breakfast. They were up all night dealing with the multitudes. He was up all night dealing with the multitudes that wanted to make him king. They were misguided in their beliefs. He's dealing with his disciples and their unbelief. And now the demands of more of the multitudes. Stephanie made a comment about multiplying the bread by division, giving more bread by division. This event of him going throughout this region is basically the same thing. In verse 56, as many as touched him were made well. He's multiplying the healings by dividing his power, but not losing any bit of it. Isn't that amazing?
It is. That makes me think of Acts 19:11, where Paul's in Ephesus, and I don't know why, but the verbiage there, I guess, reminded me of that verse. It says, and God was doing extraordinary miracles by the hands of Paul, so that even handkerchiefs or aprons that had touched his skin were carried away by the sick, and their diseases left them, and the evil spirits came out of them. So he passes that on to his apostles, and they have the same ability without it diminishing any of their power. And the fact that the Holy Spirit imparted it to them.
Wow, so he divided it amongst the 12, multiplying the work and the power. That's amazing. Brittany, you got anything you want to add?
Everything about this particular passage right here is just straight chaos. At least in my head, when I'm trying to picture it, it's just like they crossed over, and it's like As soon as they got out of the boat, people immediately recognized him. Now you've got all these people running, and just imagine, if you try and use your imagination, look, it's Jesus, it's the man who heals. Grab your sick, grab your weak. Like, it's just so much chaos going on. And then they're running up to him, and then it's just like wherever they heard he was, that's where they were going. And then like in verse 56, it says they laid the sick in marketplaces. I mean, like, there are people, we're trying to shop out here. There are people that aren't sick, that are doing just fine. We're just trying to buy our spices. And you got sick people laying all in the middle of these marketplaces. It just, the whole scene is so chaotic. But then again, at the end of verse 56, where it says, and as many as touched him or touched it were made well, the fringe of his garment. You think about when we read about the lady that had the 12-year issue of blood. She said the same thing, if I could just touch the hem of his garment, and it kind of makes you think, I mean, word obviously had to spread about her to some way, or people just realized the great amount of power that he had. But it's just like, he denied none of them. Like, Jesus is just walking. He feels the power coming out of him, because we saw that back in Matthew. I'm sorry, not Matthew. We saw that back in Mark, was it 5? And it's just like, as soon as he touched him, or as soon as she touched him, he was like, who touched me? And the disciples are like, Jesus, there are so many people here. How could you even say that? And he was just like, no, I felt power come out of me. And the same thing is happening here. So he feels that power coming out of him. And D, I like what you said about he multiplied and divided, but he lost nothing. He denied none of them.
Yeah, about being all touched out.
Yeah, and I think about, like, we just did camp this past week, and anybody who knows Brittany knows she don't camp. That's just not my thing. I don't want to be hot. I ran from so many bugs. I tried to stay in the AC as much as possible, but it was nice to be around the kids. But after a while, it's just like these precious little beings, they want to hug you all the time, and they just want to love on you. And Miss Brittany, I'm like, no, I'm done. Just leave me alone. Stop touching me. Stop talking to me. And Jesus never does any of that. He never does any of that. Just, I'm walking through these markets. You want to touch me? I'm letting you touch me. And I feel my power going out, but I'm not going to deny any of you. And I just think that is such a blessing. And then I thought about, I think it was First Thessalonians 5:23 through 28, where it talks about, God makes everything holy and whole, and it's you see that here. God, everything that comes within his path, every person that wants to be with him or desires him in some way will be made whole. And I think that's such a blessing.
All right. Well, that brings us now to where we see the love of Christ. All right, Brittany?
Okay, where do I see the love of Christ? I see it everywhere, honestly. But where I see it the most is earlier when we spoke about Jesus's compassion. The people, they see him on the boat or see him walking on the water, they freak out, and immediately he spoke to them, and it's like we mentioned earlier, it says that he meant to pass them by, but he didn't. I think that's another imagery of God stretching out his hand and, I'm here for you. Don't be afraid. You have nothing to fear. It's me. And then, of course, at the end of the chapter as well, 53 through 56, there's so much chaos going on, but, Jesus just walks by and he allows these people to touch him. He allows his power to go out through him, and he denies none of them at all. And I think it's also a testimony of these people in the faith that they had as well, because it was their faith that allowed them to be made whole. Like, Jesus has the power, but the power only works if you have the faith. but he denied none of them. Whether that faith was going to be just in that moment, or whether that faith was going to carry them through the remainder of their lives, he didn't deny any of them. And obviously he knew who would stay with him, who was only there for that moment, but he denied none of them. And I just think that's such a blessing and such a great thing for us to remember as well. Our faith is only going to allow us to go so far. Like we gotta believe that he is capable.
Stephanie?
I see it in verse 51 I'll see it when Jesus is walking on the water. When the wind ceased and he got in the boat, when Jesus is with us, it calms the storm. And we don't always think of it that way. Sometimes in our minds, it's backwards. But I like that picture there. And we can have peace even when our lives are in chaos. Because I think I was at a ladies' day, and this is a quote from a friend. She said, everything may not be okay, but I can be okay in the midst of that when I have Jesus. And that's the truth. I mean, they were okay even before he stilled the storm. Which, we don't have the account here. It's in Matthew of Peter walking on the water. Can you imagine? Like, total side note here. Like, watching Peter walk on the water. Like, just, what?
I know.
And then him start to sink, of course, and all the chaos there. But
And then go, what?
Yeah.
Well, I see it in verses 45 and 46. Here we are. Jesus has very little sleep. He's got the stress of people swarming him. He never complains, and he's constantly doing God's will. In 46, he sends his disciples away. Well, in 45, he sends his disciples away for protection, to take care and diffuse the multitude that wanted to make him king. He does that today for us. He knew what would happen or could happen, and he knows with us too. And just like he calmed the storm, he calms our storm too. All right, great. That was a good episode. Thanks again for joining us today. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to contact us. We would love to study with you or connect you to someone local. As always, we hope you will seek to know the love of Christ in your life. Until next time, bye.
Bye.
Bye. You can reach out to us on Facebook or Instagram. We would love to hear from you. And be sure to click like and share this episode with family and friends. In doing so, you're sharing the love of Christ.